By the time they called her bag suspicious, every camera in the plaza had already begun recording their downfall. It was just after 4:30 on a gray Thursday afternoon in Oak Ridge Commons, the kind of upscale shopping center where polished glass reflected every passing face and soft jazz drifted from hidden speakers above the storefronts. People moved with purpose, carrying coffee cups, shopping bags, and that familiar look of suburban ease, like nothing truly bad could happen under clean sidewalks and expensive window displays. Then the shouting started. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. A few people slowed near the center fountain, pretending not to stare while staring anyway. Near the entrance of Belmere Jewelers, Naomi Carter stood beside a black leather tote resting at her feet, her posture straight, her jaw set, her expression unreadable. She was 38, dressed in a navy blazer, dark jeans, and low heels, the kind of woman who carried herself with quiet control, as if she had learned long ago that raising her voice rarely changed anyone's mind. Across from her stood Officer Derek Vaughn, broad-shouldered, flushed with authority, one hand resting too confidently near his belt while the other pointed toward the tote like it had personally offended him. Beside him, Officer Melissa Grant watched with narrowed eyes and a notepad already in hand, as though the story had been written before a single question was asked. "Step away from the bag, ma'am," Derek said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "We've received a report of suspicious behavior." Naomi did not move right away. Her eyes dropped to the tote, then lifted past Derek's shoulder to something higher, quieter, easier to miss. One of the dome cameras mounted beneath the steel awning blinked red in the fading daylight. "Suspicious behavior," she repeated, calm enough to make his tone sound even harsher. "That's what we're calling it now." A woman in yoga clothes whispered to the man beside her. A teenager pulled out his phone. Somewhere behind the glass, a store employee froze mid-step with a velvet box still in both hands. The whole plaza seemed to hold its breath, that strange public silence. Settling in when people know something is wrong, but are not yet sure whether they will do anything about it. Derek took a step closer. "You were seen leaving an area after multiple complaints. You were clutching the bag and avoiding staff. So I'll ask you one more time. Step away from it." Naomi's fingers loosened from the strap, but only slightly. There was no panic in her face, no frantic denial, no trembling effort to prove herself to strangers who had already begun deciding who she was. That was the unsettling part. She looked not defeated, not confused, but almost disappointed, like this moment had arrived exactly on schedule. "Officer," she said softly, "you may want to check every camera before you make this worse." Derek gave a short laugh, the kind meant to shrink a person in front of witnesses. "That's so," he said. "You giving instructions now?" Naomi said nothing. The silence stretched. Melissa bent slightly toward the bag, cautious but eager, while two more phones rose from the crowd. Overhead, another camera angled toward the scene from the edge of the parking structure, capturing the scene from above like a second pair of eyes. The wind moved through the plaza, lifting a napkin across the pavement, rustling the planters, carrying with it the faint metallic rattle of a flagpole from somewhere beyond the storefronts. And standing in the middle of all that polished comfort and gathering judgment, Naomi Carter did the one thing nobody expected. She looked directly at the crowd, then back at the officers, and let them believe, for just a few more seconds, that she was the one with something to hide. Melissa crouched beside the tote with the careful seriousness of someone trying to look objective in front of a growing crowd, but the tension in her shoulders gave her away. She wanted to find something. That much was obvious. Her pen was tucked behind one ear, her radio crackled softly at her shoulder, and her eyes moved over the zipper, the seams, the brass hardware, as if suspicion itself were evidence. Naomi remained still, hands visible, chin slightly raised, the cool late afternoon light catching the edge of her cheekbone while the plaza watched in. Silence. It was the kind of silence that did not feel neutral. It felt selective. A stroller stopped near the bakery patio. A delivery driver paused with a hand truck halfway up the curb. Even inside Belmere Jewelers, two sales associates hovered near the doorway, their polished smiles gone, their faces sharpened by the thrill of seeing someone else become the center of public scrutiny. Officer Derek Vaughn glanced around and seemed almost energized by the attention. Some men grew quieter when too many people were watching. Derek grew larger. "Open it," he said. "Now." Naomi looked at him for a long second before answering. You already decided what you want this bag to mean, she said. Her voice was level, low, and controlled, but it carried farther than shouting would have. So let us not pretend this is about caution. A murmur rippled through the people nearest the fountain. Derek's mouth tightened. He did not like being spoken to like that, not by a woman who refused to sound afraid, and certainly not by a black woman standing in the middle of a plaza where people in pressed khakis and designer sunglasses had already started shaping the story in their heads. You were reported by multiple witnesses, he said. You were lingering near restricted access points, moving between storefronts, and holding onto that bag like your life depends on it. Naomi's gaze shifted for half a second to the second-floor balcony, then to the mirrored panel above the jewelry store entrance. There were cameras there too, small and dark and easy to ignore unless you knew how to look for them. Maybe because some things are worth keeping close, she said. Melissa pulled the zipper open. The sound seemed to slice through the plaza. Every eye locked in. Inside were a tablet, a leather folder, a silver charger, a bottle of water, a cosmetics pouch, and a thick envelope secured with a red band. Nothing explosive, nothing illegal, nothing dramatic. And yet Derek did not step back. That was when the mood shifted from concern to something uglier. Because once the contents failed to justify the suspicion, he should have let the moment die. Instead, he leaned forward and said, "Move the folder." Melissa did. Under it sat a second device, thin and black, no bigger than a paperback book, with a small antenna folded flat against its side. A few people in the crowd gasped, relieved to have their fear handed back to them. Derek's confidence returned instantly. "There it is," he said. "What is that?" Naomi did not answer right away. She watched Melissa lift the device with both hands, uncertain now, as if she had expected something simpler, something that would fit neatly into a report. Not this. Not a mystery. Naomi drew in a slow breath and looked once more toward the camera under the awning, its red indicators still blinking. Then she said, with the same quiet steadiness that had unsettled them from the start, "That depends on which part of the footage you review first." For the first time since he walked up to her, Derek looked less certain. It lasted only a second, but it was there. A flicker, a crack, and near the entrance to the security office across the plaza, a man in a gray blazer had just stepped out, staring at the scene with the pale, drained expression of someone who suddenly realized he was not watching a misunderstanding unfold. He was watching evidence wake up. The man in the gray blazer stopped just outside the security office as though the air itself had changed temperature. Ethan Brooks was the operations manager for Oak Ridge Commons, 46 years old, meticulous, always polished, the kind of man who remembered lease dates, maintenance schedules, and the names of store owners' children. He liked systems because systems made people predictable, but the expression on his face now was not control. It was fear trying to disguise itself as concern. He took 3 quick steps toward the officers, then slowed when he noticed the phones pointed his way and the device in Melissa's hands. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, but the question came out thinner than he intended. Derek turned toward him immediately, grateful for a new authority to lean on. "This woman was flagged after complaints from staff," he said. "We found an unidentified piece of equipment in her bag." Ethan's eyes flicked to Naomi, and for the first time since this began, someone other than Naomi seemed to understand exactly how dangerous the next 10 seconds could become. Naomi did not say a word. She only looked at him with that same unwavering stillness, as if giving him one last chance to decide what kind of man he wanted to be while there was still time. Around them, the crowd had grown thicker. The outdoor tables near the coffee shop were nearly empty now because people had drifted closer, drawn by that familiar, shameful magnetism of public humiliation. A little girl asked her mother what happened, and the mother hushed her without ever taking her eyes off Naomi. The teenager filming stepped onto the edge of the planter for a better angle. Somewhere above, a gull cried once and disappeared into the cloudy sky. It was strange, Naomi thought, how ordinary the world remained even when truth stood inches away from breaking open. Melissa turned the black device over in her hands. On one side was a small government inventory label, partially covered by a strip of matte tape. She frowned and brushed her thumb across it. Derek noticed too late. "Do not touch anything else," Naomi said, her tone calm, but now edged with something firmer, something official enough to make even the nearest bystanders stiffen. Derek looked at her sharply. You do not get to give orders here. No, Naomi said, her eyes still on the device. But I do know when someone is about to mishandle evidence in front of 6 different camera angles. The words landed harder than they should have. Evidence. Not property. Not belongings. Evidence. Melissa's grip loosened just slightly. Ethan swallowed. Derek laughed again, but there was less confidence in it now, more effort. Evidence for what? He asked. Naomi shifted her gaze to him, and for the first time, there was no trace of patience left in her expression. That depends on whether you want the short answer, she said, or the one your internal affairs division is going to hear. A low murmur passed through the crowd. Internal affairs. The phrase changed the atmosphere instantly. A minute ago, this had looked like another public stop, another scene people could watch and then explain away over dinner. But those 2 words cracked the illusion. Ethan stepped forward too quickly. Officer, maybe we should continue this privately, he said, forcing a smile that convinced no one. We do not want to create confusion in front of tenants. Naomi let out the faintest breath through her nose. Not quite a laugh. Not quite pity. Confusion is not the problem, she said. The problem is that your cameras recorded more than you expected. That was when Derek's jaw tightened. He had not liked the mention of cameras from the beginning, but now something deeper crossed his face. Recognition. He turned toward Ethan with the briefest flash of accusation, the kind passed between people who shared more than procedure. Naomi saw it. So did Melissa. And that mattered, because Melissa had started this afternoon certain of the role each person played. Now she looked from Derek to Ethan to Naomi, and the neat outline of guilt she had accepted was beginning to blur. What footage? Melissa asked quietly. Naomi answered without hesitation. The footage from the North Promenade, the service corridor behind Belmere, and the camera above the West Valet stand. Ethan's color drained so fast, it was almost startling. Those were not guesses. Those were exact locations. The crowd could not know what that meant, but the people who worked in Oak Ridge Commons certainly did. Naomi took one small step forward, not aggressive, not rushed, just enough to shift the balance of the moment. At 4:07, she said, a member of private security crossed a restricted line carrying an item that did not belong to him. At 4:09, he placed that item near a maintenance cart beside Belmere. At 4:11, he made a phone call. At 4:14, Officer Vaughn arrived. Nobody moved. Even the plaza itself seemed to go quiet. The fountain behind them kept running, but softer now, like the whole place had leaned in. Naomi looked directly at Melissa. Ask him why he got there so fast, she said. Then she turned to Ethan, and her voice dropped into something cold enough to make his shoulders fold inward. Or better yet, ask him who told him where to find me. For one long second, nobody answered. Derek stood with his shoulders squared, and his face locked into that hard expression men use when they believe posture can still save them after certainty begins to slip. But posture was not proof, and the plaza had already changed sides in the most dangerous way possible. Not toward Naomi, not fully, not yet, but away from the easy story they had accepted at first. You could see it in the way people stopped whispering and started listening. You could feel it in the stillness around Melissa Grant as she kept holding the device without lowering it, as though some part of her had suddenly realized she was no longer standing inside a routine stop. She was standing in the middle of something much larger, something that had started before any of them stepped into view. Ethan Brooks opened his mouth, closed it, then forced out a strained breath through his nose. I do not know what she thinks she is implying, he said, but even he did not sound convinced by the sentence. Naomi turned her eyes toward him, calm and cold at once. I am not implying anything, she said. I am giving you an opportunity. That word seemed to land deeper than any accusation could have. Opportunity. It suggested there was still a narrow bridge between silence and accountability, and everyone standing their new bridges like that did not stay open forever. Derek looked at Melissa. Put that back in the bag, he said. We are taking it in. But Melissa did not move. It was only the slightest hesitation, barely visible to the crowd, yet it changed everything. Because until that moment she had followed Derek's lead with the clean instinct of a partner who trusted the script. Now she was thinking. And once thinking begins, loyalty gets louder questions. Officer Grant, Naomi said, her voice measured, before you touch that device again, Ask yourself why an ordinary citizen would be carrying equipment tagged to a federal inventory system. Melissa's eyes dropped to the side label again. The matte tape no longer hid enough. A line of printed numbers. A partial agency code. Not something you bought at an electronics store. Derek stepped closer, his tone dropping lower, sharper. You do not need to listen to her. Maybe she does, Naomi replied. A breeze moved through the plaza and lifted the loose hair at the nape of her neck. The fountain continued its quiet rush behind them. Somewhere near the coffee shop, a cup tipped over and rolled a few inches across the concrete before coming to a stop. Small sounds. Normal sounds. The kind that made the tension feel even heavier, because they reminded everyone that truth rarely arrives with thunder. Sometimes it arrives under strip lighting, in public, while strangers hold shopping bags and pretend they did not help build the moment with their silence. Melissa looked from the device to Naomi, then to Ethan. How does she know the exact camera positions? She asked. No one answered. Naomi did. Because I mapped them. The teenager filming lowered his phone for the first time, stunned enough to forget the screen in his hand. Ethan's face lost what little color it had left. Derek gave a short scoff, but it sounded forced now, desperate around the edges. You expect us to believe you were just walking around here mapping cameras? Naomi tilted her head slightly. No, she said. I expect you to believe that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The silence after that was different. Heavier. Cleaner. Melissa finally lowered the device to waist level, but she still did not return it to the bag. Her instincts were splitting now, one side pulling toward procedure, the other toward self-preservation. What is your name? She asked Naomi, quietly this time, not as a challenge, but as a formal question. Naomi looked at her for a beat that felt deliberate, almost merciful. Naomi Carter, she said. Senior Investigations Liaison, Special Compliance Detail. Derek's expression did not collapse all at once. It cracked in stages, the way ice breaks over dark water. First confusion, then rejection, then that fleeting, unmistakable flicker of fear. He looked at Ethan again, and this time there was no mistaking it. There was history in that look. Coordination. Naomi saw it. Melissa saw it. Even the crowd, though they did not understand the details, understood enough to sense that the ground had shifted beneath the officer's feet. Ethan tried one last time to regain control. Anyone can say a title, he said, but his voice had become thin and papery. Then let us not rely on words, Naomi answered. She lifted one hand slowly and pointed, not at Derek, not at Ethan, but across the plaza toward the dark glass window of the security office. At 4:02, your team disabled live remote review on camera banks 3 and 4. At 4:06, someone inside that office overrode the service corridor archive to local access only. At 4:12, Mr. Brooks, your badge entered the control room for exactly 58 seconds. At 4:14, Officer Vaughn arrived before the public call was even logged. Melissa's head turned sharply toward Ethan. Derek's jaw clenched. The crowd murmured, louder now, sensing names, times, specifics. Facts carried a different weight than outrage. Facts made denial feel smaller. Naomi took one slow breath and let the numbers settle over them like a verdict waiting for its proper room. This was never about a suspicious bag, she said. It was about intercepting what was inside it before the footage could leave the property. Ethan stepped back as if the sentence had physically reached him. That is not true. Then invite everyone into the security office, Naomi said. Pull the local archive. Play the North Promenade at 4:07. Play the West Valley camera at 4:11. Play the corridor outside Belmere, and let these officers explain why they responded to me before the complaint existed. Derek moved fast then, not violently, but urgently, toward Melissa and the device. Hand it over. She drew it back on instinct. It was a small motion, barely 6 inches, but it spoke louder than anything anyone had said so far. Naomi watched that motion and knew the moment had finally tipped. Not because justice had arrived. Not yet. But because doubt had entered the right mind at the right time, and once that happened, the cameras were no longer the only things recording everything. Melissa kept the device close to her body now, not out of ownership, but out of uncertainty, and that uncertainty was the first real crack Naomi had seen in the wall around Officer Derek Vaughn all afternoon. The plaza no longer felt like a shopping center. It felt like a courtroom without a judge, A place where every face in the crowd had become a silent juror waiting to see who would blink first. Derek looked around and seemed to understand that too. The phones in the air, the eyes fixed on him, the careful distance people kept now that the story had stopped being simple. He had stepped into this scene expecting control, expecting compliance, expecting the familiar rhythm of accusation followed by submission. Instead, he had a woman who knew the camera grid better than the operations manager, a device tied to federal inventory, and a partner who had just refused his direct instruction in front of witnesses. "This is over," Derek said, but he did not sound like a man ending a situation. He sounded like a man trying to outrun one. "We are moving this inside." Naomi did not flinch. "That would be convenient," she said, "especially if the archive disappears before anyone sees it." Ethan Brooks wiped one hand down the front of his blazer as though smoothing fabric could steady a collapsing day. His eyes kept shifting toward the security office window across the plaza, then back to Naomi, then to Derek. He looked less like a manager now and more like a man mentally calculating how many doors were still open to him. None of them were good. Melissa glanced toward the office too, then back to Naomi. "If what you are saying is true," she said carefully, "then why would you be standing out here alone?" Naomi answered without hurry. "Because people who think they can profile a black woman in public usually do not expect her to be the one setting the timeline." That line moved through the crowd like an electric current. It was not loud, not dramatic, but it pulled the truth into the open in a way everyone could understand. This was not just about procedure. It was about assumption, about how quickly a black woman with a bag could be turned into a threat in the eyes of people who needed very little to justify suspicion and even less to perform it in front of strangers. Naomi saw the shift on their faces. Some looked down. Some looked embarrassed. Some looked angry for reasons they would never fully admit. "Imagine standing there," she thought, "while your calm is treated as defiance, while your silence is read as guilt, while the very thing that should protect you, evidence, is the thing they are trying hardest to reach before you can use it." Derek extended his hand toward Melissa again. "Give it to me." "No," she said. It was only one word, but it landed like a door slamming shut. Derek stared at her. So did Ethan. Naomi remained still, though inside her pulse sharpened. The afternoon had now crossed into territory no one could reverse with a polished statement or a clean report. Melissa swallowed once, then turned to Ethan. "Open the security office," she said. "Now." Ethan forced a laugh that died as soon as it left him. "You are not authorized to demand access to private operations without a formal request." "Then make one," Naomi said, "or I can make a different call." Ethan looked at her with the brittle fury of a man who knew he had already lost the room. "You think a title is going to save you?" Naomi's gaze hardened. "No," she said. "The footage will." A gust of wind moved through the plaza and rattled the menu board outside the coffee shop. Somewhere behind the crowd, a car alarm chirped once and stopped. Derek took a step back and pressed 2 fingers to the microphone clipped near his shoulder, but whatever he meant to say into the radio never came out. Naomi had already seen the movement and spoke before he could recover. "Body camera audio is being preserved too," she said, "including everything said after first contact." Melissa's eyes flicked to Derek's chest, then to her own, then back to Naomi. Another piece of the day slid into place. Derek lowered his hand. "You have got this all wrong," he said, and for the first time since he approached her, there was strain in his voice that sounded almost human. Almost. Naomi looked at him for a long second, and when she answered, her tone held neither pity nor anger. Only certainty. "No," she said. "I have it timed." The crowd murmured again, louder this time, because facts always made people uneasy when they had secretly been hoping for spectacle instead of truth. Ethan's phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and went pale. Naomi noticed the change immediately. "Who is it?" she asked. Ethan did not answer. Derek moved closer, trying to see the display, but Ethan turned it inward too fast. That told Naomi more than the screen itself could have. Someone inside the system had realized the stop had gone public. Someone was worried. Melissa saw it too. "Put it on speaker," she said. Ethan shook his head. "It is nothing." "That is not what your face says," Naomi replied. Ethan's hand trembled once before he silenced the call. That single motion was enough. Not proof in a legal sense, but enough to shift instinct into pattern and pattern into understanding. Naomi took one measured breath, feeling the air cool against her skin as the sun slipped lower behind the parking deck. The plaza lights had begun to glow, soft amber against glass and concrete, and under that gentle evening shine the whole polished world around them seemed suddenly unable to hide what it was built to protect. At 4:18, Naomi said, looking directly at Ethan, "You received the same call you got last Thursday after camera bank went dark for 11 minutes. Same number, same sequence, same panic." Ethan stared at her, speechless now. Melissa's expression changed from doubt to realization. Derek's from control to calculation. Naomi could see all three versions of fear at once. One feared exposure. One feared implication. One feared being left alone to carry the blame. And somewhere deep inside the security office, behind tinted glass and locked doors, the footage that could tie them all together was still waiting to be played. For the first time all afternoon, Ethan Brooks looked like a man who understood that silence could no longer protect him. He stood there with his phone still in his hand, the screen gone dark, his polished shoes fixed to the concrete, as if movement itself might draw more attention than he could afford. Around him, Oak Ridge Commons kept performing normalcy. The fountain water rose and fell in clean silver arcs. The jewelry store lights glowed warm behind glass. A woman in a cream sweater adjusted the strap of her purse without realizing she had not taken a single step in. Almost a minute. But the illusion had cracked. People were no longer watching a suspicious stop. They were watching a system begin to expose itself one frightened decision at a time. Melissa Grant shifted her weight and looked across the plaza toward the security office again. The tinted glass reflected the crowd, the officers, the storefronts. The entire scene folded back on itself like a lie trying to look polished. "Open the office," she said again, firmer now. Ethan let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, except there was no humor in it. "You do not understand what you are stepping into," he said. Naomi met his eyes. "I understand exactly," she replied. "What you do not understand is that this did not begin today." Those words hung there for a moment, and the crowd went quiet in a different way now, less curious, more intent. This was the pivot point, the place where a public humiliation stopped being random and started revealing its history. Derek Vaughn crossed his arms, trying to recover some version of authority, but the effort only made him look rigid. "Then explain it," he said. "Explain why you were here. Explain the device. Explain why you knew names, timestamps, and camera sectors before any of us said a word." Naomi did not answer immediately. She looked past him, beyond the bystanders and the patio umbrellas and the polished stone walkway, toward the second-floor corridor where the North Promenade cameras sat hidden in brushed steel housings. Her voice, when it came, was steady and low enough to make people lean in. 3 months ago, she said, a cash transport vendor reported a discrepancy tied to one of the luxury tenants here. 2 weeks later, a maintenance contractor disappeared from the schedule after filing an internal complaint. Then a teenage employee from the valet stand claimed she saw a private security escort someone through a service corridor after hours. Her statement was buried within 48 hours. Ethan's face tightened, but Naomi continued without looking at him. At first, it looked like separate events. Missing inventory, altered logs, selective camera outages, quiet complaints that went nowhere. But every trail bent back to this property. Melissa frowned. "And you were assigned to what exactly?" Naomi turned toward her. "To determine whether a private security network operating on commercial property was being used to facilitate theft, intimidation, and selective targeting under cover of local response." Derek scoffed, but it came too fast, too brittle. "Selective targeting?" Naomi's eyes found his. "Yes," she said, meaning incidents were more likely to escalate when the person being confronted looked unlikely to be believed over uniforms, reports, and property management. The words landed with surgical precision. No shouting, no dramatics, just a truth too clean to dodge. A man near the front of the crowd lowered his phone and stared at Derek with open discomfort. A woman by the fountain folded her arms, suddenly ashamed of how quickly she had accepted the scene when it began. Naomi felt none of their sympathy. She had learned years ago that public guilt often arrived only after danger had passed. What mattered now was the pattern. "I came here today because your network was scheduled to move something off-site through the Belmere service corridor at 410, Naomi said. "I was positioned to document the handoff, confirm chain of access, and secure the transfer route on camera. Instead, someone identified me before the exchange completed. Melissa glanced at Ethan. How? She asked. Naomi answered before he could. Because someone in the security office saw me appear in a camera zone I was never supposed to understand. Ethan's lips parted, but no sound came out. Derek stepped forward half a pace. You still have not shown any credentials. Naomi gave him the faintest look of disbelief. And yet you were ready to detain me without seeing any. That stung because it was true, and truth always sounds louder in public when prejudice has already done the first half of the work. Derek's face darkened. Melissa looked from one to the other, and Naomi could see her rebuilding the day in real time. The quick arrival, the vague complaint, the insistence on the bag, the rush to move everything inside. Each detail had sounded procedural by itself. Together they sounded staged. Naomi continued, her voice softening only in volume, never in force. The device in your hand is not contraband. It is a field sync receiver. It mirrors encrypted camera pulls and preserves metadata if a local archive is altered, which means if anyone inside that office tried to wipe footage after I entered the plaza, the attempt itself was logged. A murmur moved through the crowd. Derek's expression changed again, and this time Naomi saw it clearly. Not anger, not even fear. Calculation collapsing under certainty. Ethan looked toward the security office window one last time, as though he could still will it into silence. Then, somewhere inside the building, a door alarm chirped once, sharp and unmistakable. Melissa turned at the sound. Naomi did too. And when a man in a navy suit stepped out from the side corridor holding a tablet against his chest, flanked by two plainclothes agents moving with calm purpose, Naomi finally allowed herself one measured breath. She had not needed rescue. She had needed timing. The crowd parted without being told. Derek went still. Ethan seemed to shrink where he stood. The man in the navy suit stopped 6 feet from Naomi, looked at the device in Melissa's hands, then at the officers, and spoke in a voice so controlled it made everyone else sound unsteady by comparison. Naomi Carter, he said, we have the mirrored archive. And just like that, the plaza stopped feeling like a place where the wrong woman had been cornered. It became the place where everyone finally understood who had been standing there all along. The words settled over the plaza with the force of something far heavier than volume. We have the mirrored archive. That was all it took. No sirens. No shouting. No dramatic gesture. Just one calm sentence from a man in a navy suit. And suddenly the entire balance of power changed direction. Naomi Carter remained exactly where she had been, shoulders level, hands relaxed at her sides. But the meaning of her stillness was different now. A few minutes earlier, the crowd had seen a black woman being cornered over a bag they were told not to trust. Now they were staring at someone who had walked into a trap, recognized it in real time, and outlasted everyone who thought they could define her before she spoke. The man who had stepped out from the side corridor was Special Agent Rebecca Sloan's field director, Daniel Mercer, a quiet, sharp-eyed supervisor whose calm always made everyone else's panic look louder. The two plainclothes agents beside him said nothing. They did not need to. One carried a sealed evidence pouch. The other held a phone already connected to a live secure channel. Daniel looked first at Melissa Grant, then at the black device in her hands. That receiver is active and intact? He asked. Melissa swallowed and nodded once. I did not alter it. Daniel gave a small, approving nod. Good. Then he turned toward Naomi, and there was the faintest change in his expression, not warmth exactly, but recognition earned under pressure. The override attempt was logged at 4:15 and 4:17, he said. Partial deletion request from local access. It failed. Ethan Brooks closed his eyes for half a second, and in that half second the last of his practiced composure seemed to leave him. Derek Vaughn stared at Daniel like a man trying to calculate whether confidence could still carry him through facts that already existed outside his control. Naomi looked at Daniel and asked the one question that mattered. Do we have the North Promenade? Daniel lifted the tablet slightly. We have the promenade, the West Valet stand, the Belmere service corridor, and the internal door log from security control. The crowd did not understand the full significance of those locations, but they understood enough. Evidence had names now. Places, timestamps, structure. Public suspicion was turning into documented sequence, and there was nothing more dangerous to a cover-up than order. Melissa glanced at Derek, then away from him. "What does the footage show?" she asked quietly. Daniel did not answer her at first. Instead, he tapped the tablet screen and angled it toward Naomi. Even from several feet away, she could see the clean grid of captured frames, each stamped with time, camera number, and sync verification. There she was at 4:06 walking the North Promenade with measured steps, not lurking, not evading, simply moving through the plaza while checking sightlines reflected in the glass storefronts. At 4:07, a private security guard named Leon Pike crossed out of a staff-only corridor carrying a small hard case tucked beneath a folded maintenance tarp. At 4:08, he paused beside a utility cart near Belmere. At 4:09, he spoke briefly into his phone while looking directly toward the camera dome mounted above the awning. At 4:10, he placed the hard case where it could be transferred without appearing in open view. At 4:11, Ethan Brooks entered the security office. At 4:12, 2 camera feeds were redirected to local control. At 4:14, Derek Vaughn arrived from the east access lane. Naomi looked away from the screen and let the silence do its work. Imagine standing there and realizing the story they tried to place on you had already been disproved by the very system they counted on to erase you. Imagine hearing your own timeline spoken back to the people who thought they had more authority than truth. Derek finally found his voice. "That does not prove anything about her." Naomi turned slowly toward him. "No," she said. "It proves something about you." The words were not loud, but they cut through the plaza so cleanly that even the fountain seemed quieter afterward. Daniel tapped again, opening another clip. This one showed Naomi near the Belmere entrance at 4:13, setting her tote down only after glancing toward the mirrored panel above the storefront, clearly aware of the surveillance angle. Seconds later, Leon Pike disappeared from frame. Then Ethan's badge logged into control. Then Derek entered from the parking deck side, less than 90 seconds after the internal call. Melissa's brow tightened. "There was no public dispatch yet," she said, almost to herself. "Correct," Naomi replied. "Because the complaint was never meant to protect the public. It was meant to isolate me before the archive could leave the property." Ethan took a shaky breath. "You do not know that." Daniel looked up from the tablet then, his voice cool and exact. "Actually, we do." The internal call from security to Officer Vaughn was placed 53 seconds before any tenant alert. "We also have audio from the corridor camera." Ethan's face lost what little color it had left. Derek's did too, though he fought harder to hide it. Naomi watched them both and felt no triumph. Only the cold, familiar clarity that came when the mask finally slipped off a system that had counted on her being unreadable but never informed. The crowd had gone completely silent now. No whispers. No fake concern. No easy assumptions left to lean on. Just the raw discomfort of people watching two kinds of authority collide and realizing too late which one had been real all along. Daniel lowered the tablet. "Ms. Carter," he said, formal again now. "Your documentation is secured. We are ready to proceed." Naomi gave one small nod, then looked directly at Melissa Grant, whose grip on the receiver had softened into something close to respect. "Now," Naomi said, her voice steady as stone, "let us see who was really carrying the suspicious package." Melissa Grant did not move at first. She stood with the receiver in both hands, eyes fixed on the tablet Daniel Mercer held, as if she needed one more second to let the truth settle into the place where instinct used to be. Around them, the plaza had become so quiet that the low hum of the storefront lights sounded louder than the crowd. Naomi Carter could feel the shift in every face turned toward her now. It was no longer the sharp, suspicious stare people gave a black woman when a uniform suggested danger. It was something far less comfortable. Recognition. Shame. The uneasy realization that they had watched a lie unfold and almost helped it succeed just by being ready to believe it. Daniel tapped the screen again. This time he did not keep the image to himself. He angled the tablet where Melissa could see it clearly, and she stepped closer, drawn by procedure first, then by disbelief. The footage from the Belmere service corridor came up in crisp grayscale. At 4:07, Leon Pike exited a staff door, pushing a maintenance cart with a folded tarp draped over the side. At 4:08, he stopped near the corner where the corridor opened into a narrow service lane behind the jewelry store. He checked over his shoulder. He removed a hard case from under the tarp. He set it down behind a cleaning bin. Then he looked directly into his phone and said something into it. Daniel switched to synchronized audio, and even though the sound was faint, it was clean enough to cut through the evening air. "She is here," Leon's voice said. "Black woman, navy blazer, tote bag. Move now before she reaches the west exit." No one in the crowd spoke. Naomi did not either. She had heard that line already inside her own mind a dozen times since the first alert hit her earpiece, but hearing it out loud in public made the day feel even colder. Daniel advanced the clip. At 4:11, Ethan Brooks entered the control room. At 4:12, Camera Bank 3 dropped from network review to local access. At 4:13, Leon walked away from the hard case empty-handed. At 4:14, Derek Vaughn's patrol vehicle appeared at the east access lane, faster than any normal response should have. Then Daniel opened the corridor audio again. This time a second voice came through, clearer, lower, unmistakable. "Ethan, do not let her leave with the bag." Melissa's head lifted slowly from the screen. She looked at Ethan as if seeing him for the first time without the shield of his blazer, his office, his practiced little smiles. Ethan opened his mouth, but there was nothing left in him that sounded convincing. "That is out of context," he said, and even he seemed to know how weak it was the second it reached the air. Naomi turned toward him, her expression unreadable. "Context," she said softly. "You identified me by race, clothing, and location before any threat existed. Then you redirected camera access, called an officer directly, and helped create the stop." Ethan shook his head too quickly. "We were protecting the property." "No," Naomi said. "You were protecting the route." Daniel changed the screen again. The next angle showed the hard case more clearly. A plain black shell, no logos, no labels, carried through a corridor that should have required log transfer approval. Then came the final clip. West Valet Stand. 4:16. A dark SUV backed toward the service lane. Leon Pike approached with empty hands because the transfer had been interrupted when Naomi was stopped. The vehicle waited 9 seconds, then pulled off. Daniel lowered the tablet slightly. "The package was not inside Ms. Carter's tote," he said. "It never was." A woman near the front of the crowd pressed her lips together and looked down. The teenager who had been filming since the beginning lowered his phone entirely now, his face pale with the realization that he had almost recorded the wrong person's humiliation instead of the right people's exposure. Derek Vaughn tried to recover ground with the last tool he had left. "Tone. Even if that is true," he said, "I was responding to information given to me in good faith." Naomi looked at him for a moment that felt almost merciful. "Then explain why your body camera was switched to buffer-only mode for the first 40 seconds of contact," she said. Melissa's eyes snapped toward him. Daniel did not need to confirm it. His silence did. Derek's face changed in a way that told the whole plaza everything it needed to know. Not guilt in a cinematic sense. Something more ordinary and more ugly. The face of a man who had done this before and expected the structure around him to absorb it again. Naomi felt the weight of the afternoon settle in her chest, but not as fear anymore. As clarity. This was never one misunderstanding. It was a method. A system of selective suspicion, private coordination, and polished deniability, built on the assumption that the right woman could be cornered in public and no one would ask the right questions fast enough. Melissa stepped away from Derek then, not dramatically, not angrily, just far enough to show the distance had finally become official. "Officer Vaughn," she said, voice tight but controlled. "Is that true?" He did not answer. Ethan did what frightened men often do when facts outrun them. He looked for escape in motion. His gaze flicked toward the security office door, then toward the parking structure, then toward the crowd as if there might still be some way to slip through public confusion. But confusion was gone now. In its place stood sequence, footage, audio, and a black woman he had underestimated because he thought calm meant powerless. Daniel turned to one of the plainclothes agents and gave a small nod. The agent stepped toward the service corridor without a word. Naomi picked up her tote from the pavement and slipped the strap over her shoulder. The same bag they had built an entire accusation around, now returned to what it had always been. A tool, a container, a target only because they needed her to look dangerous before the evidence made them visible. Then she looked at Derek, then Ethan, and her voice came out quiet enough that people had to lean in to hear it. "You did not stop a suspicious woman," she said. "You interrupted an investigation because you thought the easiest person to discredit would also be the easiest to silence." No one answered. They could not, because the cameras had already answered for them, and the footage was no longer hiding behind tinted glass. No one reached for Naomi when it was over. That was the strangest part. After all the noise, all the suspicion, all the certainty they had wrapped around her like it belonged there, the end arrived in near silence. Daniel Mercer gave a brief instruction into his secure line. One plainclothes agent moved toward the service corridor. Another stepped toward Ethan Brooks and asked for his access badge in a tone so calm it left no room for performance. Melissa Grant removed her hand from the receiver and held it carefully out to Daniel as evidence, not because someone had forced her to, but because she finally understood what it had been from the beginning. Derek Vaughn stood a few feet away, still wearing the same uniform, still under the same plaza lights, and yet somehow looking smaller than when he first walked up to Naomi beside the fountain. Authority had not left him all at once. It had drained out of him in pieces, one timestamp at a time. Around them, the crowd began to shift in that awkward way crowds do when they realized they stayed too long for the wrong reason. A man who had watched from the coffee patio looked down at his shoes. The woman in the cream sweater pulled her phone to her chest and turned away. The teenager who had recorded nearly everything lowered his eyes when Naomi glanced in his direction, not because she blamed him specifically, but because he had just learned how easy it was to witness injustice while mistaking it for information. Naomi adjusted the strap of her tote on her shoulder and stood in the center of the plaza as evening settled over Oak Ridge Commons. The amber lights above the storefronts had fully come on now, reflecting in the glass like a softer world than the one she had just exposed. She could smell roasted coffee from the cafe, perfume drifting from the department store entrance, the faint mineral scent of fountain water in the cooling air. Everything looked polished again. That was the danger of places like this. They knew how to hide themselves in comfort. Melissa took one hesitant step toward Naomi. "Miss Carter," she said, and her voice had none of the sharpness it carried earlier. "I should have asked better questions." Naomi studied her for a moment. There was no satisfaction in her face, no smugness, no hunger to humiliate her back in front of strangers. Only a tired clarity that seemed older than the afternoon. "You should have asked them sooner," she said. Melissa lowered her eyes, and that was answer enough. Ethan said nothing as his badge was taken. Derek tried once to speak, then stopped, because there are moments when even practiced excuses know they have arrived too late. Daniel turned to Naomi. "The archive is secured, the transfer route is frozen, and the internal logs are preserved," he said. "This part is done." Naomi looked past him toward the tinted security office windows, now dark against the rising dusk. 3 months of buried complaints, rerouted feeds, quiet profiling, and selective stops had led to this exact evening, this exact plaza, this exact public unraveling. They thought they were intercepting a black woman with a bag. What they were really intercepting was the moment their own system could no longer hide behind polite language and clean architecture. Naomi took a slow breath and let it leave her without hurry. Imagine standing there after being judged in seconds, after being watched like a threat, after knowing the whole time that the people questioning you were the very people afraid of what you carried. Not a weapon, not contraband. Truth. She turned to leave then, heels quiet against the stone walkway, the tote resting at her side as naturally as it had before any of this began. No grand speech, no dramatic exit, just one final pause near the fountain where Derek had first pointed at her bag and decided what kind of story she would be. Naomi looked back once, not at the crowd, not at the storefronts, but at the officers and managers who had counted on her silence. When she spoke, her voice was low, steady, and impossible to mistake. "You saw something suspicious because you wanted someone to fit the fear you already had," she said. "The cameras saw what you did with that fear." Then she walked on, and the plaza stayed quiet behind her, held in the kind of silence that comes when truth does not need to shout to win. Because in the end, they trusted their assumptions. She trusted the record. And that was the difference between power that performs and justice that remembers. When a black woman is publicly stopped over a so-called suspicious bag at an upscale shopping plaza, a routine confrontation turns into a gripping justice thriller as hidden footage begins to expose a deeper network of profiling, false assumptions, and coordinated misconduct. What starts as humiliation quickly becomes one of those unforgettable black stories where dignity, patience, and truth outlast power. As the police officer pushes the accusation further, the black woman stays calm, knowing the cameras have captured far more than anyone realizes. This emotional story blends tension, silent strength, and a powerful reversal that fans of black stories will recognize instantly. With surveillance evidence, buried timelines, and a shocking reveal tied to private security and local authority, the story delivers the kind of cinematic payoff that makes black stories so compelling for viewers who crave justice-driven drama. The police officer thinks he is controlling the scene, but every second brings him closer to the truth he tried to outrun. Meanwhile, the black woman becomes the living proof that restraint can be stronger than intimidation. Rich with atmosphere, suspense, and moral clarity, this is one of those black stories that turns public judgment into public reckoning, and one of the most satisfying black stories for audiences who believe truth does not need to shout to win.